A remote village tucked away from the modern world was once a place of tranquility and simplicity. Its rolling hills and lush green forests had long been untouched by the chaos of city life. A peaceful haven where time seemed to stand still. But then, something strange happened, something that no one could have predicted. One day it all simply disappeared. No warnings, no signs of an impending disaster, no traces of the people who had once called this place home. It was as if the village had been swallowed by the earth itself, leaving behind nothing but silence. For years the outside world had only vague, scattered reports about the village. Whispers from travelers who had passed through but never stayed for long. They spoke of the peculiar aura that surrounded the village, of its enigmatic customs and strange happenings that never seemed to make sense. But no one truly knew the story of the village, not until much later when a handful of survivors came forward, and secrets, long buried, began to surface. The first clues about what had truly happened started with the discovery of a small, abandoned room in the heart of the village. Local authorities, who had initially thought that the village had been deserted by choice, were shocked to find that there was no record of any migration or departure. There were no legal papers, no documents, no traces of any official attempts to move or resettle the inhabitants. It was as if they had simply vanished without a trace. As investigators combed through the remains of the village, they made a chilling discovery. A pile of charred remains, blackened and scorched, lay in the center of what was once the town hall. The walls were covered with the remnants of burned documents, official records, old letters, photographs, and more. Everything was destroyed. The history of the village, its people, its existence, wiped away in a fiery blaze. At first, it was assumed that the fire had been an accident. But as authorities dug deeper, a chilling theory began to take shape. The villagers hadn't just burned their records. They had destroyed them deliberately. Someone, perhaps the villagers themselves, had made the decision to erase their entire history. But why? What could possibly justify such an act? Why would a community, seemingly content with their lives, go to such lengths to erase everything they had ever known? The authorities were left with more questions than answers. As the investigation continued, more secrets began to emerge. Pieces of the village's past, once thought to be lost forever, slowly resurfaced. A few old villagers who had survived the mass exodus began to tell their stories. But these stories weren't the innocent, carefree tales one might expect from the last remnants of a peaceful community. Instead, they spoke of strange visitors, outsiders who had come and gone without a trace. They spoke of fears, of dark shadows that lingered at the edges of the village, of whispers in the night. One woman, a former resident, recalled an encounter with a stranger who had come to the village years before the disappearance. She described him as an older man with a peculiar air about him, someone who seemed to know far too much about the village's past. His questions were unsettling. He asked about the village's history, its most treasured secrets, its most guarded beliefs. At the time, the villagers thought little of it. He seemed harmless enough, just another traveler passing through. But in hindsight, they realized that his interest had been far more than casual. He had known something they had not yet grasped. It wasn't long before rumors began to spread about the strange behavior of the village's leaders in the months leading up to the disappearance. The elders, once seen as wise and trustworthy, began acting strangely. They became reclusive, holding private meetings in the dead of night, their faces drawn with worry. They spoke in hushed tones, and whenever outsiders came to visit, they were sent away with vague excuses. The once open community had become closed off, its inhabitants becoming increasingly paranoid. The villagers began to wonder if they were being watched, if they were being followed. And in the final days before the village disappeared, many of them claimed to have seen strange figures lurking in the shadows, their faces obscured by the night. One resident, an elderly man who had lived in the village his entire life, spoke of an ominous sense of dread that had gripped the community in the final months. He recalled feeling as though something was lurking just beyond their reach, something dark and dangerous. But he never imagined that the truth would be far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. What the villagers didn't know was that their seemingly peaceful lives were inextricably linked to a far darker force, one that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The village, it seemed, was not just a random collection of people. There were connections, ties that bound the villagers to a much larger, more sinister plan. As investigators pieced together the last few fragments of evidence, they uncovered a terrifying possibility. The village had been part of a secret underground network, an organization that had operated for years in the shadows, pulling the strings behind many of the region's most significant events. The villagers had been pawns in a game far larger than they had ever realized. And when the time came they were to be erased, their records destroyed, their history wiped clean. But the question remained, who had orchestrated this? Who stood to gain from the disappearance of an entire village? The investigation turned to those who had never been suspected before, the outsiders, the strangers who had appeared just before the village vanished. The theory grew stronger that they had been sent by a shadowy group, perhaps government agents or even something darker. But no one could prove it, and the village's complete disappearance left no traces of these shadowy figures. They had simply vanished as well. As the investigation stalled, more survivors came forward with their own cryptic accounts. Some spoke of dreams, of visions, of whispers in the night that told them to leave before it was too late. Others spoke of seeing something in the sky, a dark shape moving swiftly, almost as if it had been watching them. It was as though the village had been under some kind of watchful eye, one that had been patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. The chilling realization began to take hold. The villagers may not have disappeared on their own. Something had driven them to vanish, something that had been lurking in the shadows for years, waiting for the moment when they could strike. But what was it? And why had they chosen this village to erase? The more the investigation uncovered, the less it made sense. The questions only multiplied, and each answer seemed to open up more mysteries than it solved. The village, it seemed, had never been a peaceful haven at all. Instead, it had been a place of hidden darkness, of secrets too terrible to reveal. And as the last remaining survivors faded into obscurity, the true nature of the village's disappearance remained shrouded in mystery. Even now, as the years pass and the village's story fades from the memories of the outside world, the haunting question remains: what really happened to that village? What drove them to destroy their own history? And what did they know that no one else ever will? The answers are lost, buried beneath the ashes of the burned records, forever out of reach. And as time moves on, the village's ghost lingers, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover its secrets. The village had always been a place that existed on the fringe of the world, tucked away in a remote corner of the country, far from the bustle of modern life. Its isolation was both a blessing and a curse. It protected the village from the encroaching dangers of the outside world, yet it also kept them in a bubble, isolated from progress and the changing tides of history. Life there was simple and predictable. The villagers had their routines, their quiet ways, and for the most part they were content. There was a comfort in the daily rituals, in the familiar faces, and in the sense of community that tied them all together. But beneath the surface of this seemingly tranquil existence, there were whispers, whispers of a past long buried, of secrets that had been hidden from view for generations. And as the years went by, those whispers grew louder, until they could no longer be ignored. The village had always been something of an enigma. While its physical beauty was undeniable, rolling hills, expansive fields, and peaceful streams, there was something intangible about it that made outsiders uneasy. Visitors would often remark on the strange energy that seemed to linger in the air, a sense that something was always just beyond the reach of understanding. People who had come to the village to escape the chaos of the world often found themselves drawn into its mysteries, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched, or that something was not quite right. There was a sense of timelessness to the village, an unspoken rule that nothing changed, that things remained as they had always been. But as the years passed, there were signs that the fabric of that timelessness was beginning to tear. It started with the rumors. The first whispers of something amiss came from travelers who had passed through the village but never stayed. They spoke of the village's odd customs, of the strange way the villagers interacted with one another. Some claimed that the villagers were friendly but distant, that they maintained a level of secrecy that made them uncomfortable. Others said the villagers seemed to be hiding something, that there were conversations that ended abruptly when outsiders arrived, or that certain topics were never discussed. In a place so small, with so few people, it seemed odd that there would be so many unspoken rules, so many things that went unsaid. But when the outsiders left, the village returned to its quiet state, and the rumors faded into the background. But the whispers never truly disappeared. They only grew. The next signs of trouble came in the form of the village's leaders, those who had once been seen as the wisest and most respected members of the community. The elders were the keepers of the village's history, its traditions, and its culture. They were the ones who ensured that the ways of the past were upheld, and that the younger generation was taught the values of their ancestors. But in the months leading up to the village's disappearance, the elders began to act strangely. They became more reclusive, more secretive. They held late-night meetings in the town hall, their voices low and anxious. The village's once open doors were now closed to outsiders, and anyone who came seeking information was sent away with vague explanations and hurried excuses. It was as if something was happening behind closed doors, something the rest of the village was not allowed to see or understand. Some villagers began to notice the change too. They spoke of a growing sense of unease, of a feeling that something terrible was on the horizon. There were rumors of strange visitors, outsiders who came and went without leaving a trace. They were said to have arrived under the cover of night, disappearing as quickly as they came. These visitors were never seen in the daylight, never interacted with the villagers in any meaningful way. Yet their presence seemed to cast a shadow over the village, one that hung heavy in the air. And then, as quickly as it had all begun, the village fell silent. In the days before its disappearance, the people were restless. The streets, once filled with the sound of laughter and conversation, were empty. The marketplace, which had once been a hub of activity, was deserted. The familiar faces of neighbors and friends were nowhere to be found. It was as if the entire village had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the faintest trace of its existence. The few outsiders who had been passing through found themselves caught in the eerie quiet, unable to understand why the village had suddenly ceased to be. No one seemed to know where the villagers had gone or why they had left. In the midst of the silence, the first clues began to emerge. A small group of investigators, drawn to the village by the mysterious disappearance, arrived on the scene. At first, they thought it was simply a case of mass migration, a community deciding to leave for reasons unknown. But as they explored the village, they quickly realized that something much darker had occurred. The houses, though abandoned, were intact. The personal belongings of the villagers were still there. Clothes left on the line, half-eaten meals left on tables, books open to the last page read. It was as if the villagers had walked away from their lives without a second thought, leaving everything behind. But there was something more troubling: the records. Official documents, photographs, and other important papers, gone. Vanished without a trace. The investigators were shocked to discover that in the town hall, where the village's most important records had been kept, there was evidence of a fire. But it wasn't just any fire. This fire had been carefully controlled, deliberately set to destroy something. The charred remnants of papers, photographs, and official documents littered the floor, the flames having consumed nearly everything in sight. It was as if the villagers had set fire to their own history. The records were gone, and with them, the story of the village. Its past, its people, its reasons for existence, erased. At first, the investigators couldn't understand why anyone would do such a thing. Why would a community, seemingly content with its life, destroy its own history? What could possibly drive people to wipe away their past so thoroughly? Theories began to emerge. Perhaps the villagers had been trying to protect themselves from something, an outside threat, a secret from their past, a dangerous piece of information that they could not allow to be discovered. Or maybe they had been trying to escape something they had been running from for years. The more the investigators uncovered, the more questions they had, and the fewer answers they found. As they dug deeper, they began to uncover fragments of information, bits and pieces of the village's past that had somehow survived the fire. It wasn't much, but it was enough to suggest that the village had been hiding something far darker than anyone could have imagined. The villagers had been living with a secret, one that they had kept hidden for generations. But what was it? And why had they gone to such lengths to protect it? The deeper the investigators went, the more they realized that the village's disappearance was not just a simple act of migration or abandonment. There was something far more sinister at play. Something that had driven the villagers to burn their own records, to erase their own history, and to disappear without a trace. And as they continued to search for answers, they couldn't help but wonder, was this just the beginning of a much larger mystery? And would they ever uncover the truth of what had really happened in that remote village? The answers were out there, hidden among the ashes and the remnants of a forgotten past. But would anyone ever be brave enough to find them? The more the investigators delved into the remains of the village, the more the mystery deepened. What began as a simple case of a vanished community had turned into something far more complex and unnerving. The discovery of the burned records was only the first piece of the puzzle, but as they uncovered more fragments of the village's past, they realized that the villagers had been hiding something much darker. The burning of the documents wasn't a random act. It had been deliberate, an effort to erase not just the village's history, but something far more dangerous that might be tied to it. The first thing that struck the investigators was the sheer thoroughness with which the records had been destroyed. It wasn't just that the documents had been burned, they had been obliterated, reduced to ash. Even the faintest traces of writing or imagery had been scorched away, leaving behind only the remnants of paper and ink that could no longer be deciphered. Whoever had done this had been careful, almost meticulous in their destruction. It was clear that whatever the documents contained was something that had to be erased completely. The village's history, its connections, its secrets, everything had been swept away in one calculated act of annihilation. Yet, amid the ashes, small fragments of evidence began to emerge. In the town hall, there were still remnants of old books and papers that had been only partially consumed by the fire. It was here that the investigators found the first hint of something larger, a list of names written in a faded, almost indecipherable script. At first glance, the list seemed innocuous, nothing more than a collection of ordinary names. But as the investigators examined it further, something about it felt wrong. These were not just the names of villagers or townsfolk. Many of the names were unfamiliar, and there were odd notations next to some of them, dates, symbols, and markings that didn't make any sense. The investigators soon discovered that the list was only the tip of the iceberg. As they pieced together the few surviving records, they found references to an organization, a shadowy, secretive group that appeared to have had a significant influence on the village. This group, whose name remained elusive, seemed to have been operating in the background, pulling strings and shaping the village's history in ways that no one had realized. It became clear that the villagers were not living in isolation as they had always believed. They were part of something much larger, something far more dangerous. The presence of this organization was hinted at in several fragments of the burned documents, as well as in the cryptic conversations that had been recorded in the village's last months. Some villagers spoke of the Watchers, mysterious figures who had come to the village under the cover of darkness, always leaving before dawn. These visitors were never seen during the day, never interacted with the villagers in any meaningful way. Yet their influence was unmistakable. There were whispers of strange rituals, of meetings held in secret locations, and of promises made to the village's leaders in exchange for cooperation. But what these promises entailed, no one seemed to know. What was becoming increasingly clear was that the villagers had been caught in the middle of something much larger than themselves. An operation, a conspiracy, or perhaps a covert mission that they had been unknowingly swept into. But why? What did this group want with a small, isolated village? And why had the villagers gone to such lengths to protect whatever it was they had been involved in? As the investigation progressed, more survivors came forward, each with their own version of the story. These were the people who had managed to escape the village before it disappeared, the ones who had seen the writing on the wall, the ones who had sensed that something was terribly wrong. Their accounts were fragmented, often contradictory, but they painted a picture of a village in the grips of a slow, creeping paranoia. The villagers had not been simply afraid of outsiders, they had been afraid of themselves, of what they had become, and of what they had allowed to happen in their midst. One survivor, an elderly woman who had lived in the village for most of her life, spoke of the elders' growing desperation in the months before the village's disappearance. She recalled the strange meetings, the hushed voices, and the increasingly erratic behavior of the village leaders. The elders, once seen as the wise and steady hands guiding the village, had begun to make strange decisions, allowing outsiders into the village, giving them access to places that had always been off-limits. The woman remembered the night she overheard a conversation in which the elders spoke of an impending change, a shift that would come whether the villagers were ready for it or not. They spoke of the need to protect the village from those who would destroy it, but they never explained who those were. The woman never asked, fearing that to do so would only draw attention to her questions. Instead, she left the village as soon as she could, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. And when she finally learned of the village's disappearance, it confirmed her worst fears. Another survivor, a younger man who had recently started a family in the village, described how the community had grown increasingly isolated in the months leading up to the event. People stopped talking to one another, and trust between neighbors began to erode. The man remembered how the villagers began to whisper about the outsiders, those who came and went without explanation, and how some of the younger people had started to become restless, questioning the elders' authority. But just as the tension reached its peak, the village simply disappeared. No warning, no explanation, just a silence that stretched on for days. As the survivors spoke, a troubling pattern began to emerge. The village had been under the influence of something or someone that had manipulated them for years. The records they had burned weren't just a simple matter of erasing history. They had been destroyed to protect something that, if revealed, could bring the entire village down. The villagers were not simply protecting their own legacy. They were protecting a much darker secret. But what could that secret be? What could possibly justify such extreme measures? The investigators began to consider the possibility that the village had been involved in something criminal, A hidden operation, a conspiracy, or even a violent act that had been covered up for generations. They speculated that the village's destruction was not an accident, but a carefully orchestrated attempt to erase any trace of its involvement in something that could never be made public. But the question remained, what had they been involved in? And more importantly, who had the power to make the village disappear so completely, so ruthlessly? The more the investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that the village's disappearance was no ordinary mystery. It was a cover-up, an effort to erase not just a community but a network, a system that had existed in the shadows for years. And as they dug deeper into the wreckage, they began to wonder if they would ever be able to uncover the full truth of what had happened there, or if the answers would remain hidden forever, lost to the flames and the ashes of a past that could never be reclaimed. The more the investigation unfolded, the clearer it became that there were deeper layers to this mystery than anyone had originally imagined. The village's complete disappearance, the sudden burning of records, and the cryptic stories from the few survivors left behind, all these scattered pieces painted a picture of a community caught in the grip of something far larger than their isolated existence. The villagers were not simply protecting their own lives or their way of life. They were guarding something much darker, something that had been buried beneath their quaint routines for years. And the investigators, now deep into the heart of the mystery, began to uncover terrifying truths, one piece at a time. The first breakthrough came when they traced a link between the village's disappearance and a notorious historical figure. This figure, long thought to be nothing more than a ghost story, had been whispered about in the region for decades. His name had been spoken in hushed tones, and his alleged actions had never been fully documented. But now, for the first time, there was evidence that this person, or at least someone tied to his legacy, had been involved with the village. The more the investigators dug, the more they uncovered disturbing connections that seemed to suggest the village had been a key player in a much larger, darker scheme. As the research into this historical figure progressed, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The village, it seemed, had been part of an underground network, one that had been operating for decades. This network, led by a secretive group of individuals, had been linked to some of the most controversial and scandalous events of the time. The villagers had not been living in isolation as they had always believed. They had been part of something far more dangerous, something that had been manipulating the course of history from behind the scenes. And the question that plagued the investigators was, how deep did this network go? And what was its true purpose? Further investigation revealed that the villagers had known more about this secret network than anyone could have imagined. There were records, after all, but they had been burned so meticulously, so thoroughly, that it became clear they were not just ordinary documents. These were records that contained information far too dangerous to be allowed to remain in existence. These were not just the personal histories of the villagers. They were pieces of a much larger, more sinister puzzle. The investigators began to suspect that the burning of the records had been a last-ditch effort to prevent the truth from being revealed. But why? What could possibly have been so dangerous that it warranted the complete destruction of every scrap of evidence? As the investigators pieced together the fragments, they uncovered hints of something even darker lurking beneath the surface. There were whispers of a forbidden ritual, one that had been practiced in the village for generations. The ritual, described in fragmented documents and scattered eyewitness accounts, was said to be a ceremony tied to an ancient, forgotten belief system, one that had been passed down through the village's leaders from generation to generation. The villagers believed that through this ritual, they could access hidden knowledge, power, and even immortality. But there was a price to be paid. The ritual required sacrifice that had been made not just to appease the ancient forces, but to maintain the village's connection to this otherworldly power. What became clear in the investigation was that the villagers had not just erased their history for the sake of privacy. They had done it because they were afraid of what might happen if the world found out about the ritual, about the secrets they had kept hidden for so long. They had lived in fear of the truth, knowing that if anyone ever discovered what had happened in their village, it would be the end of everything they had built. The fear was so pervasive that it had led them to destroy everything, every piece of evidence, every document, every record, anything that could reveal their secrets. But even in their attempts to cover up the truth, they had left behind clues, fragmented pieces of a puzzle that the investigators were only beginning to piece together. The village's leaders had known about this ancient ritual, and they had been the ones responsible for its continuation. As the ritual's caretakers, they had been tasked with keeping it alive, with ensuring that it remained a closely guarded secret. But as time went on, the leaders began to realize the true cost of their involvement. The ritual, which had once seemed like a means to achieve power and immortality, had begun to take its toll. The villagers had become obsessed with the idea of maintaining their connection to this dark force, and they had become willing to do anything to preserve their power. The elders, once revered for their wisdom, had become consumed by the very thing they had sought to control. But what had driven them to this point? What had pushed these seemingly ordinary people to the brink of madness, to the point where they would destroy everything, including their own history, just to keep the secret hidden? The answer lay in the ritual itself. The more the investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that the ritual had never been about immortality or power in the way the villagers had believed. It was about something much darker, something that had been waiting for the right moment to break free. As the investigators examined the ritual more closely, they began to realize that it was tied to an ancient entity, an entity that had been worshipped by the village's ancestors for centuries. This entity, described in the few surviving records, was said to be a dark force that existed outside of time and space. It was a being that could manipulate reality itself, bending the laws of nature to its will. The villagers had believed that by performing the ritual, they could summon this entity, harness its power, and use it to achieve their own ends. But as the ritual was performed over the years, the villagers began to realize that the entity was not something they could control. It was something that controlled them. It was feeding on their fear, their desperation, and their desire for power. The deeper the investigators dug, the more they realized that the ritual had never been meant to grant power. It had been a trap, one that the villagers had unknowingly walked into. The entity had been waiting for centuries, biding its time, until the moment came when it could finally break free and claim what it was owed. And when that moment arrived, the village would be the first to fall. What the investigators didn't realize at first was that the villagers had known this all along. They had known that the ritual had consequences, that there would be a price to pay for invoking this dark power. But in their desperation they had continued the practice, believing that they could keep it under control. They had destroyed their records, erased their history because they knew that if anyone ever found out what had truly happened in that village, the consequences would be catastrophic. As the investigation progressed, the true horror of what had happened began to come into focus. The village's disappearance wasn't just the result of some external force. It was the culmination of decades of manipulation, fear, and sacrifice. The villagers had been trapped in a cycle, one that had started long before their time, and they had been powerless to stop it. The ritual, the ancient entity, the network that had controlled them, it was all part of a much larger scheme, one that had been set in motion long before they even knew what was happening. The more the investigators uncovered, the more they realized that the village was not just a place. It was a symbol of what happens when people allow fear and desperation to take control. The villagers had thought they could control the power they had summoned. But in the end, it had controlled them, and now the price was being paid. The investigation into the village's disappearance was far from over. But as the pieces of the puzzle came together, the investigators began to understand the full scope of what had happened, and the terrifying implications it had for the world at large. They knew that the truth, once revealed, would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew. And the most chilling thought of all was this: the village had not been an isolated case. There were others. And the ritual, it seemed, was far from finished. As the investigation deepened, the search for answers began to take on a new urgency. The deeper the investigators dug into the village's history, the more they uncovered a disturbing pattern. One that suggested the village's disappearance was not a random event, but the culmination of years of secret planning and manipulation. With each new revelation, it became clearer that the village had not simply been abandoned. It had been targeted, erased, and hidden for reasons that no one could yet fully comprehend. The authorities, initially dismissing the village's sudden vanishing as an isolated incident, began to realize that there were far-reaching implications. This wasn't just the story of a rural community cutting ties with the outside world. The village, with its quiet history and isolated location, had been part of something far larger and far more dangerous than anyone had suspected. Something that had been hidden for centuries, slowly operating in the shadows and only now beginning to surface. As the investigators began piecing together the fragments of the village's records, they started noticing a pattern. A series of strange symbols and codes that had been incorporated into various documents, photos, and objects found among the ruins. These weren't just random markings. They were deliberate, crafted with an eerie precision, suggesting they were part of some larger system of communication, perhaps even a code that only the village's leaders fully understood. It was clear that these symbols were meant to convey something important, perhaps even vital. But what? One particular symbol seemed to appear most frequently, etched into the walls of homes, scratched onto the pages of old books, and even carved into trees outside the village. The symbol was intricate, with sharp angles and swirling lines that seemed to create an almost hypnotic effect when viewed closely. It looked ancient, as though it belonged to a time long before the village had been established. But who had created it? And why had the villagers, for generations, chosen to incorporate it into every facet of their lives? The investigators could find no reference to it in any historical texts, and no scholar seemed to be able to decipher its meaning. But there was a sense that this symbol held the key to understanding the village's secret. The more they looked into it, the more the investigators began to realize that these symbols were not just decorative. They were warnings, coded messages embedded in the very fabric of the village's history. They were signs of something much older, something that had been waiting, hidden in plain sight. The symbols suggested that the village was not merely an innocent community, it had been a focal point, a place where power was drawn from the land itself. And with that power came the promise of control, of domination, and of darkness. As the investigation expanded, it became evident that the village had been in contact with others. Other communities, other people who were also connected by this ancient force. These connections were hidden beneath layers of secrecy, buried deep within the town's forgotten history. The village had not been an isolated community, it was part of a much larger network, one that had been manipulating events, pulling strings, and shaping history from the shadows. The network, it seemed, was tied to something far older than anyone had imagined. It was part of a system of beliefs and rituals that dated back centuries, possibly even millennia. The villagers had believed they were participating in something sacred, something powerful, a system that promised them protection, power, and longevity. But the cost of this protection was steep. It required the villagers to give up their autonomy, to surrender their will to something far darker, something that had been controlling them for generations. As they traced these connections, the investigators began to uncover disturbing stories from other regions. Similar disappearances, similar incidents, all pointing to the same pattern. Communities that had been swallowed up, erased from the map, their histories destroyed, their people vanishing without a trace. These events were not isolated. They were part of a larger, coordinated effort to suppress the truth, to silence those who had been touched by this dark power. The authorities began to suspect that the village was not just a random victim. It had been a key player in this larger scheme, a focal point for the forces that had been manipulating the course of history. The key to understanding the village's disappearance, the investigators realized, was not in the village itself but in the larger context of what had been happening around it. This was not simply a case of a community breaking away or disappearing. It was the result of an ancient conspiracy, one that had been set in motion long before anyone could remember. The villagers had been pawns in a game they did not fully understand. They had been chosen, selected for their isolation, their vulnerability. And once they had been integrated into this network, once they had participated in the ritual, they were marked. Their fates were sealed. They were part of a much larger plan, one that had been moving steadily, imperceptibly through history. The investigators began to realize that the true horror of the village's story lay not in its disappearance, but in what had happened to the people who had lived there. The villagers had not simply been erased from history. They had been transformed, altered in ways that no one could have predicted. The ritual that had been performed in secret for generations had not just granted power, it had altered the very fabric of their existence. The villagers had become something else, something beyond human, bound to the ancient forces they had sought to control. It was this transformation that had led to the village's downfall. The very thing the villagers had been trying to harness, the power of the ritual, had ultimately consumed them. It had twisted their lives, warped their perceptions, and destroyed everything they had once known. The village, with all its secrets and mysteries, had become a hollow shell, its people nothing more than vessels for a power they could not control. The investigators were left with a haunting question. Had the villagers ever truly been free? Or had they always been part of something far greater than themselves, caught in the web of a dark conspiracy that had been spun long before they even knew what was happening? The more they uncovered, the more the lines between victim and perpetrator blurred. The villagers had been manipulated, yes, but they had also been complicit. They had allowed this dark power to shape their lives, to control their fates. And in the end they had paid the price. But the true horror, the investigators realized, lay in the implications of all they had discovered. If the village had been part of a larger, secretive network, then the question remained, how many other villages, how many other communities had fallen victim to the same fate? And more importantly, how many were still out there, still hidden, still waiting for the next ritual to be performed? The investigators were faced with a chilling realization. The village's disappearance was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern, one that had been unfolding for centuries. The village had been just one piece in a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that no one had yet been able to solve. And as they pieced together the final threads of the mystery, they were left with one haunting thought. The truth had been buried for so long, hidden behind layers of secrecy and manipulation, that perhaps no one would ever truly know what had happened. The village may have vanished, but its secrets remained, waiting to be uncovered, if anyone was brave enough to look. As the investigation into the village's disappearance took on new layers of complexity, the team of investigators was faced with increasingly unsettling discoveries. Each piece of evidence they uncovered seemed to lead them deeper into a labyrinth of secrets, manipulation, and long-forgotten rituals, all of which pointed toward a darker, more sinister reality than anyone had anticipated. What had once seemed like a simple case of an isolated village vanishing without a trace was quickly revealing itself to be something far more dangerous, something that had been carefully orchestrated and hidden for decades, if not centuries. The symbols they had discovered earlier in the investigation had become even more central to their understanding of what had transpired. These cryptic signs, which had been found everywhere, on walls, in documents, etched into old wooden furniture, and even carved into the earth itself, were not just some relic of a lost time. They were part of a living, breathing puzzle, a map that charted the village's descent into darkness. The more the investigators looked at these symbols, the more they realized that they were not simply random. They were specific. They had a pattern, a purpose, and most importantly, they had a meaning that no one could fully decode. Yet, the presence of these symbols suggested that the village had been involved in a far-reaching network of individuals and communities that had been bound by this ancient and secretive system. The symbols, which were shared among the various locations and peoples connected to the village, seemed to indicate a larger, far more insidious force at work. This was not merely a matter of one isolated village succumbing to some local superstition or isolated belief system. This was something coordinated, orchestrated by unseen hands that had been pulling the strings for generations. And yet, despite their pervasive presence, the symbols remained enigmatic. Even the most seasoned cryptographers and historians had been unable to make any sense of them. Some of the symbols seemed to resemble ancient forms of writing, ones that had been lost to history centuries ago, but there was no definitive link to any known language. Others were more abstract, resembling geometric patterns or designs that evoked a sense of unease when stared at for too long. The symbols didn't just appear on mundane objects or surfaces. They were embedded into the very fabric of the village's layout, carved into the structure of buildings, appearing on objects that seemed to hold no practical value. It was as if the village had been designed according to a hidden code, one that was meant to guide, protect, or even control the lives of its inhabitants. This discovery of the symbols, however, led to an even more disturbing realization. The investigators began to wonder if the villagers had known more about this larger, secretive network than they had let on. Had the villagers been willingly complicit in this hidden agenda, or had they been manipulated into participating in something they did not fully understand? Were they the architects of their own doom, or were they simply pawns in a much larger game? To answer these questions, the investigation began to focus on the few surviving members of the village. They had been scattered, living in different parts of the country, their memories fogged by years of fear and trauma. Some were reluctant to speak, terrified of the repercussions of speaking out. Others were too traumatized to remember the full extent of what had happened. Yet, as the investigators gently coaxed them to share their stories, a dark picture began to emerge. One of the survivors, a man in his late 60s, had been just a child when the events leading to the village's disappearance had begun to unfold. His memories were fragmented, and he spoke hesitantly, as though unsure of what to say or how much to reveal. But what he did share was chilling. He recalled growing up in a village that had always felt different. There had been an unspoken tension that hung in the air, a sense that there were forces at work that no one dared question. The elders of the village had been revered, seen as wise and untouchable, but this man recalled how, over time, their behavior began to change. They became more secretive, more distant, as though they were hiding something they were too afraid to reveal to the rest of the village. The man recounted how, during his youth, there had been whispers of outsiders, strange visitors who would arrive in the dead of night, always cloaked in darkness. These individuals were never seen during the day, and no one knew where they came from or what they wanted. But they were always given access to the village's leaders. The survivors spoke of clandestine meetings, secret pacts being made, and a growing sense of unease among the villagers. As these events unfolded, some of the younger villagers began to ask questions, but they were quickly silenced. There was a feeling, the survivor explained, that anyone who asked too many questions would disappear. The whispers of the outsiders, the secrets of the elders, and the increasing isolation of the village all seemed to suggest that the villagers were becoming part of something far larger, something that none of them could fully understand. As the survivor spoke, the investigators realized that there was a connection between these strange visitors and the symbols they had found. These visitors, it seemed, were not just ordinary outsiders. They were part of a much larger organization, one that had been pulling the strings from the shadows for centuries. They were connected to a vast network of secret societies, each one contributing to a larger, more insidious agenda. And it was this agenda, the investigators believed, that had led to the village's destruction. The more the investigators heard about these outsiders, the more they began to understand that their presence in the village had not been coincidental. They had been deliberately set. There was a purpose to their visit, a mission that aligned with the village's ritualistic practices and its hidden beliefs. The villagers had been chosen for something far more significant than just their location. They had been selected as part of a larger plan to harness the dark power that the villagers had been tapping into for centuries. But who were these outsiders? What did they want? And why had the villagers been so eager to participate in their schemes? The survivors were vague, unable or unwilling to give clear answers, but the investigators soon began to piece together a chilling theory. The villagers had been part of a long-running ritual that spanned multiple generations, a ritual that was tied to an ancient, unseen force. This force, they believed, had been manipulating the village's leaders and residents from the beginning, subtly guiding their actions, using fear and superstition to keep them in line. As the investigation continued, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The strange visitors, the secret meetings, the cryptic symbols, they were all part of a much larger pattern. The village had been a place where this dark ritual had taken root, where the power of the unseen force had been channeled and amplified. The villagers, unknowingly, had become part of something far greater than themselves. They had been pawns in a centuries-old game, a game that had been played by forces beyond their comprehension. The final piece of the puzzle came when the investigators uncovered a long-lost journal, hidden deep within the charred remains of the village's town hall. The journal, written by one of the village's former leaders, detailed the village's history and the rituals it had practiced. The journal revealed the truth that the villagers had tried so desperately to hide. The ritual was not just about power, immortality, or protection. It was about something much darker. It was about sacrifice. The villagers had been offering themselves, their children, and their community to this unseen force, believing that by doing so, they would receive protection and prosperity. But in reality, they had been feeding the force, empowering it, and allowing it to grow stronger with each passing generation. The journal ended abruptly, the last few pages scorched beyond recognition. But it was clear that the ritual had been the key to understanding the village's fate. It had been the villagers' undoing. The force they had tried to control had ultimately consumed them, leading to their disappearance, and to the obliteration of everything they had ever known. As the investigation wound down, the investigators were left with more questions than answers. They had uncovered the dark, twisted history of a village that had been erased from existence, its people consumed by a ritual they could not escape. And yet, despite everything they had learned, one thing remained clear. The village was not an isolated case. There were others like it, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And the question now was not if more villages would disappear, but when. The investigation into the village's disappearance had become more than just a search for answers. It had morphed into an obsession. With each new discovery, the investigators were drawn deeper into the web of secrecy and darkness that had consumed the village. The more they unearthed, the more it became clear that what had happened there was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger, far-reaching network, one that spanned across generations and continents, a network of people, places, and powers that were bound by an ancient and unseen force. The investigators had started with the assumption that the village's vanishing was a rare, perhaps tragic, event. However, as they gathered more information, the scope of the mystery began to widen, revealing patterns that suggested the village had been part of something far more ominous. The disappearances of other villages, scattered across various parts of the world, began to align with the timeline and rituals that the investigators were piecing together. These villages were not simply abandoned. They were erased, their histories wiped from the face of the earth, their inhabitants seemingly vanishing without a trace. The question was no longer just about why this had happened to one village, but why it was happening in multiple locations. The investigators, now armed with more knowledge, dug into the records of other communities that had mysteriously disappeared over the years. What they found was chilling. These other villages, much like the one they had been studying, had all shared certain characteristics. They were isolated, often located in remote or difficult-to-reach areas, and they all had a rich, ancient history, one that was connected to old rituals and customs that had been passed down through generations. And in every case, these villages had been involved in some form of secretive practice, whether it was a forbidden ritual, a covert belief system, or an underground network of individuals with hidden agendas. As the investigators began to see the pattern emerge, they started to understand the true nature of the dark power that had been at work in the village, and in these other communities. It was not just a belief in supernatural forces or ancient gods, it was something more insidious, more manipulative. The rituals performed by the villagers and those in other communities were not just about gaining power or immortality. They were about control. Control of the people, control of the land, and control of the very forces of nature itself. These rituals were designed to bind individuals to this unseen power, to create a system where those in charge could dictate the course of history, shaping events to fit their own agendas. The investigators realized that these rituals had not been limited to the village. They had spread to other communities, perhaps even other countries. What had started as an isolated practice had grown into a global network, one that spanned continents and centuries. The idea of the ritual, of summoning and controlling this dark power, had been passed down through generations from village to village, community to community. And as this network expanded, so did the influence of the force that the villagers had been tapping into. It had grown stronger, more insidious, more pervasive. With this new understanding, the investigators began to look more closely at the survivors, the few who had managed to escape the village before it disappeared. These survivors were key to understanding what had really happened. They were the last living witnesses to the village's destruction, the only ones who could offer insight into the rituals, the leaders, and the power that had been wielded in secret for so long. However, getting to the truth was no easy task. The survivors were broken people, scarred by their experiences, hesitant to speak for fear of retaliation or worse, being drawn back into the web of darkness they had escaped. One survivor, a middle-aged woman who had been a young girl at the time of the village's disappearance, shared a haunting account of what she had witnessed in the final days before the community vanished. She spoke of a growing sense of unease that had begun to permeate the village, a sense that something terrible was on the horizon. The elders, who had once been pillars of wisdom and guidance, had become increasingly erratic, their behavior growing more secretive by the day. The villagers could feel the shift, though no one dared speak of it openly. As the tension mounted, the woman recalled how the elders began to hold meetings in private, discussions that were never shared with the rest of the village. She remembered overhearing one of these meetings, where the village leaders spoke in urgent tones about the need to complete the ritual before it was too late. The woman, though young at the time, understood that the ritual was something the village had been participating in for generations, though no one knew exactly what it entailed. All she knew was that it was dangerous, and that those who questioned it were quickly silenced. The woman's account was chilling. She remembered how, in the days leading up to the village's disappearance, there had been whispers of outsiders coming into the village, strangers who arrived under the cover of night, their faces hidden behind cloaks. These outsiders were said to be part of a larger organization, one that had been watching the village for years. The woman recalled hearing rumors that these strangers had been the ones orchestrating the village's final fate. They had arrived to ensure that the ritual was completed, to make sure that the village's connection to the dark power was fully realized. And when the ritual was complete, when the village had been consumed by the force it had sought to control, the outsiders made sure that no one could speak of it again. The village had to be erased. Its people had to disappear. Its records, its history, its very existence had to be wiped from the world. The survivor's account left the investigators stunned, but it was not the only one. Another survivor, a man in his late 50s, shared a different perspective. He had been one of the younger members of the village when the events unfolded, and his memories were still sharp, though filled with guilt. He spoke of the villagers' belief in the ritual, how they had come to view it as a necessary part of their existence. The ritual, he explained, was not just about power, it was about survival. Over the generations, the villagers had convinced themselves that they were the guardians of an ancient secret, that they were part of a sacred tradition that had been passed down from time immemorial. They believed that by continuing the ritual, they were protecting their village, ensuring their prosperity, and even keeping the dark force at bay. But as the ritual grew more intense, as the power they summoned grew stronger, it became clear that they were not in control of it. It was controlling them. This man's account provided a key piece to the puzzle. He explained that the villagers had initially believed that the ritual would give them the strength to defend themselves, to ward off invaders or external threats. But over time, they had become dependent on it, believing that it was the only thing that could keep them safe. As the years passed, the elders became more obsessed with the ritual, more willing to make sacrifices to ensure its success. The man recalled a conversation he had overheard between two elders, in which they spoke of a final phase of the ritual, a phase that would bind the village to the dark power forever. It was at that point that the villagers realized they had no choice. The ritual was not something they could escape from, it was their only hope. But as the survivors later learned, that hope had been an illusion. The ritual had not brought them protection. It had led them into the grasp of a force they could neither understand nor control. The more the investigators spoke to the survivors, the clearer it became that the village's disappearance was not a singular event. It was the culmination of a long history of secrecy, manipulation, and blind faith in a ritual that ultimately destroyed the very people who had believed in it. The villagers had thought they could control the power they had summoned. But in the end, it was the power that had controlled them. And now the investigators were left to piece together the remnants of the village's history, to uncover the truth about what had really happened, and to confront the terrifying reality that there were more villages, more communities hidden in the shadows, all connected by the same dark force. As the investigation continued, the investigators realized that they were not just uncovering a single mystery. They were unraveling a centuries-old conspiracy, one that had been carefully constructed and maintained by those who had wielded this dark power for generations. The question now was not how the village had disappeared, but how many others had fallen prey to the same forces, and how many more would continue to disappear, until the truth was finally exposed for all to see. The deeper the investigation delved into the events surrounding the village's disappearance, the more haunting the revelations became. The puzzle pieces, once fragmented and mysterious, were now starting to align, yet the picture they formed was one of such incomprehensible darkness and complexity that even the most seasoned investigators began to feel a sense of dread. The threads connecting the villages vanishing to a larger, far-reaching conspiracy were becoming undeniable. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that what had happened in that remote village was part of a broader, more sinister plan, one that had been unfolding for centuries and one that showed no signs of stopping. At the core of the mystery was the ritual. As the investigators sifted through the surviving records, the stories from survivors, and the cryptic symbols scattered throughout the village's remnants, they started to see a pattern of manipulation, fear, and power that had been at play for generations. It wasn't just that the villagers had been drawn into the ritual, or that they had participated in it out of superstition or ignorance. The truth was far more sinister. The ritual had been designed to bind the villagers to an ancient force, an entity that was not just powerful but fundamentally malevolent. It was a force that fed off fear, desperation, and sacrifice, and once it had latched onto a community, it would never let go. The investigators soon learned that this entity, whose nature remained unclear, had been part of the village's foundation. The elders had known about it, had sought it out, and had attempted to control it for as long as anyone could remember. The ritual itself, they discovered, had been passed down through generations, taught to the village leaders by a group of outsiders who had arrived in the area centuries before. These outsiders, it seemed, had been the keepers of a dark knowledge, one that had been shared with a select few in the village. But rather than bringing power and protection as the villagers had believed, the ritual was slowly consuming them, turning them into mere vessels for the dark force they had unwittingly invited into their midst. The more the investigators spoke to survivors and examined the fragmented records left behind, the clearer it became that the village's leaders, those revered elders, had long ago abandoned any pretense of leadership in favor of becoming vessels for the ritual's power. They had become obsessed with it, seeing it as the only way to maintain control over their community, even as it began to erode their humanity. The elders, once trusted for their wisdom, had become intoxicated by the power the ritual offered them, and they had made deals with the dark entity, sealing their fates and the fates of those around them.